All right, I'm going to answer a few questions, pulled a few from my Instagram Q&A that I thought might be worth having a bit more of a discussion about, and I'll show you a little bit of my recent training as well. But let's get straight into it. First one here comes from Thomas Rowe. He asks how to program jumps, plyos throughout phases, or do you just keep the exercises year round? I like to progress everything in a competency-based progression. So I don't plan out all my plyos at the start of the year for the squad and shift through phases. What I will do is have more themes for the phases. So early preseason, we're going to be trying to build some capacity with more extensive style jumps and plyometrics, and then we're going to build the intensiveness of those jumps throughout the course of the year. However, each individual athlete, I'm going to have them on their own specific plyometric continuum, and that's going to be based on their injury history, their position and positional demands, calf capacity, make sure that their tissue is able to tolerate the style of jumping that we're doing. In particular, anyone with a history of any style of tendinopathies, whether that's patella or Achilles, and their movement quality and coordination is going to play a big role in this as well. So I've got my continuum, I'll show that on the screen here as well, and each player will just sort of plug into the relevant progression for them. In the gym, I'm generally going to focus more on jumps and hops, and on the field we'll try and work towards more bounding, unless your program requires that you get more of your plyos in the field. If you're doing gym straight into a field session, then we might do some bounding as part of like an ignition session. Next question comes from Roe Diesel. Best way to go about implementing off-feet conditioning during pre-season and in-season. I'm going to look at off-feet conditioning to address three separate aspects. That's either going to be for body composition. So at the start of pre-season, if we've got an athlete who isn't getting the DEXA scan or skin fold results we'd like, then they're probably going to go into some extra off-feet conditioning. It's also going to be based on their aerobic energy system capabilities. So that comes from our testing as well in pre-season. And then the third one is going to be related to injuries, rehab, and reconditioning. So based on those use cases, it's always going to depend a little bit. If an athlete doesn't really fit into one of those categories, then off-feet conditioning is not generally going to be a major part of my programming. We might use it to top someone up if they've got to be modified at any stage, in which case I'm just going to plug them into a more generic off-feet conditioning session. In terms of the guys who need a more targeted off-feet conditioning protocol, then we'll identify the length of the protocol that we want to implement, and we'll periodize it to some degree. So with a more extensive to intensive progression, and we're obviously going to try and make it objective as much as possible. However, off-feet conditioning is only ever general in terms of the mechanical loads that you're going to get from it. So you're not getting the impact loading and the coordination pattern that's going to be relevant to running, obviously. So you just need to understand that the limitation is all you're really going to get from it are going to be those central adaptations, in which case an emphasis on more extensive style prescriptions is what I would prefer. Next question, integrating conditioning into fielding drills. Is this a bunch of low-hanging fruit? This one comes from McCann Jack, 99. So obviously related to cricket and fielding fitness, essentially. I'm yet to really see fielding fitness done well in cricket. What I have seen, and something that we do, is we'll have a couple of team fielding drills that are a bit more standardized, and we'll try and encourage the players to compete on some GPS metrics around high intensity efforts to ensure that we've got players working off the ball and injecting themselves into the drill. However, when it comes to mixing conditioning with fielding, I think what you end up with is getting stuck in the middle ground where the quality of the fielding ends up being quite poor and the conditioning effect is pretty suboptimal. So I would rather do both of those things separately and be able to do them well. If you've got a fielding drill that lends itself to working hard off the ball, players backing up throws, attacking the ball, and there's some GPS metrics that you might want to get the players to compete on, then I can see a place for that. But trying to get two birds with one stone. I think you actually just end up being a man chasing two rabbits and catching neither. How would you use GPS, and what metrics do you look for, and how do you take decisions based on these? GPS is a huge topic. There's two key aspects to how we use GPS. There's the load monitoring side of the equation. For that, I'm looking at total distance, high-speed running meters, very high-speed running meters, acceleration and deceleration counts, and basically you're going to use some form of acute and chronic workload monitoring, an overlay to understand the distribution of training. You don't want to get caught up too much by the ratios and the equation and let that make the decisions for you, but understanding the chronic load and the acute load and the interaction between those two is going to help you understand whether or not we're pushing our players too much or if we're underloading them. So I like to look at both of those aspects, and obviously understanding the context. It's really important that we don't just let the ratio make decisions for us. But yeah, that's the load monitoring side of things is quite a complex task to decipher. The other side of it is going to be more performance-related metrics. When we're talking about performance, there's going to be aspects such as driving intent or trying to train at or above peak game period intensities. The other part of it is going to be stuff related to in-sessional targets, and that might be something like a very high-speed running volume that we've got specifically targeted, like a cap for a player that we need to get them to, and that feeds back into the load monitoring side of the equation in terms of we're planning loads to ensure our players are loaded enough, they stay resilient, and also things like max velocity exposures, etc., that all come within a session. So that's the live feedback side of things. GPS, very good at providing some objective measures around external load, and then the real challenge and the real trick is distilling down what you think is really important and valuable, and then focusing in on those aspects. All right, we're going to finish off with one more question. Before that, if you like this type of video, make sure you hit the like and subscribe button, share it if you think this information is useful for anyone, and if you've got any other questions that you think might be useful for a video style answer, put them in the comments below. Moch, what are your thoughts on conditioning coaches only conditioning through small-sided games? I always talk about the trade-off when it comes to specificity versus overload. The reason that we do training rather than just playing the game is that inherently we all know that whilst the game is the most specific stimulus, it has limitations. Okay, so you can play and play and play and play, and eventually you will reach a threshold where the game is no longer providing any overload for you to continue adapting and improving. That's why we have training, and training needs to remove a little bit of specificity to create overload. If all we're doing is small-sided games for conditioning, you have to understand and accept that you are going to limit the amount of overload that you can get in that. What you'll find is that the players with a high game IQ, they know how to read the play really well. You just look at someone like a Lionel Messi who just walks around when he's playing and injects himself only at the moments he needs to. He or an athlete like him is not going to get a great conditioning effect from a small-sided game because they only use their energy in the way that they need to. The other side of the equation as well is if you don't have a really strong monitoring system, like something like GPS, then there's going to be gaps where players they'll basically tank. You'll have some players who they'll just try and hide in the game. They don't really see the value in it, and they will try and avoid doing the hard work. Obviously, it's important for us as coaches to try and get the buy-in from them, but you're always going to have players who aren't pushing themselves as hard as they can in small-sided games. I'm not saying don't use small-sided games. They're a fantastic tool, and at the right time, for the right group, then absolutely use them. But there's still a role for traditional conditioning. There's still a role for ensuring that there's objectivity, there's targets, and there's consequences for not creating those physical outputs in a conditioning session. So I like a mixed approach where you're using a variety of different methods, and I think traditional conditioning methods, I like to use the framework of understanding the mechanical output and the metabolic output that each of those drills leans themselves well to. and then using that to fill the gaps that the game and your small-sided games are unable to deliver. So, for example, what we know is that in some positions, in some sports, players, they need the resilience to handle very high speed and high speed running, but traditional training does not necessarily give them enough of that. So something like MAS running or tempo running is going to give your players good exposure to that style of running with the mechanical load that's associated with it. So you're going to obviously get those central energy system development style adaptations, but you're also loading the tissue mechanically, which improves your resilience and robustness. So that's why I like a mixed method where you're using a variety of different aspects to create a holistic, well-rounded conditioning program for the athletes. If you enjoyed this, make sure you share it, like it, add a comment down below, and we can do another episode moving forward. Thanks.